and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. How can we as parents become scientists and apply logic to understanding and supporting our PDA children and teens? So today, I am here with you, founder of At Peace Parents, Casey, and super dork, wanting to share with you some of the logic and lessons that I have brought from my background as a social scientist to support your PDA child or teen. So today we're going to talk about what's called empirical questions, okay? And I'm going to dive deep into what that means and why it's important. But I want to start with a brief story from yesterday's live call from the Paradigm Shift program. I'm going to make this anonymized and sort of more generic than it was. But during the spot coaching of our program, I was speaking with a mom whose primary question was, is my daughter's control around eating, restrictive eating, related to anorexia nervosa or control coalescing around food as an aspect of the PDA neurotype? Okay, so the behavior that was observed is my child won't eat, right? And many of us have experienced this with either eating or other basic needs where there's controlling behavior around whether or not they engage in hygiene, whether or not they'll sleep, whether or not they'll eat, or maybe they're eating all the time compulsively. So we have this behavior that we observe, right? And so she asked, what is the root cause of this? Is it PDA? Is it anorexia nervosa, which has more to do with body image, self-concept, more thoughts versus cumulative nervous system activation from consistently perceiving losses of autonomy and equality, and then starting to control a basic need as a way to get back to nervous system safety, which may have nothing to do with body image at all, right? It might be, I'm only going to eat McDonald's, right? I'll only eat the fries from McDonald's. So these are two different root causes. They come from two different parts of the brain and thus require two different approaches, right? The appropriate approach for anorexia nervosa might be behaviorally based, where we don't want the child to get stuck in that sticky thinking around controlling what they eat for calories, versus a PDA approach where accommodations will support the nervous system activation to lower, and then they won't be controlling so much around food. Okay, so the mom asked this question to me. And what I said was, this is an empirical question. Okay, so what does that mean? What that means is I don't know the answer to that until we experiment and collect data. Okay, because it could be two different reasons. It could be more than one. Right? It could be OCD, it could be anorexia nervosa, it could be PDA. And actually, these root causes in the brain require different approaches. But when people like y'all come into my world, it's usually because you've only worked through one lens or one approach, right? And you, whether or not you realized you were doing this, saw the data of your child starting to get worse, right? Like maybe you applied traditional behavioral approaches, or your child was diagnosed with OCD, so they went through like an exposure program. And the reason you ended up here is not because it made things better, right? If it worked, you wouldn't be here with me, okay? And so we can develop a hypothesis based on the idea that if a child has gone through consistently the paradigm of a behavioral approach or an exposure approach or a traditional parenting approach, and things have continued to escalate along three dimensions, increasingly not accessing the basic need, increased nervous system activation. So it could be like increasingly shut down, disassociative, selective mutism, or it could be increasing, quote, defiance and opposition into fight-flight behavior. and engagement and connection. Okay, so those 3 dimensions is something we can actually measure upon, which gives us empirical data. So empirical just means we can observe it. We can see it with our own 2 eyes. It's not just a feeling. It's not just an idea. It's not just an assumption or a philosophy or a value. It's something we can see. Okay? And so all of you have come into this page, this world, this space of PDA because you have observed empirically, whether or not you knew what to call it, that, ooh, things are getting worse or this isn't working, right? So when we come into the PDA space, we have a different hypothesis about what's causing the distressing behaviors, the lack of engagement and connection, and trouble accessing basic needs. And so often when I'm working with families, they're going to be asking me questions that I'm going to be responding to with, this is an empirical question, meaning we need to experiment with a different approach consistently and collect data on what really matters to your child and then determine the root cause. Okay? So I was going to tell an anecdote about my past life. Let me just tell it because it relates to what we're talking about. Okay, so before my son went into burnout and before I left my career as a social scientist, I worked at one of the largest policy and nonprofit organizations in the United States in Washington, D.C. And my job was to run a team that vetted the methodological integrity of the policy work. Right? The research had to be backing up whatever they were advocating for in Washington, D.C. with legislators. Okay. So I had to make sure with my team of researchers, fact checkers, methodologists, that it was unbiased, error-free, and methodologically sound. So we would often go into these methods reviews that I've done hundreds of them, where I would sort of vet the research that they were presenting and their research design. And they would often say, we're trying to prove that, for example, we're trying to prove that if we protect this marine area of this island, it will improve tourism. Or if we implement this new technology with medical records, we'll reduce the incidence of wrong prescriptions prescribed. Okay? So the advocates were approaching it as, this is the outcome. Right? Like, this is what we know to be true. And I would always have to be like, let's take a step back. This is an empirical question, right? We don't know for sure. We don't know. And that's why we have to collect data and determine if the data proves our hypothesis or not, right? So that was my job. That was my job to slow down the advocates, take a step back, understand the research question, and make sure we were approaching it in an unbiased way. And sort of the role that I play with parents, especially in the program or the coaching, is this objective. Let's take a step back. Let's experiment and collect data on what you care about. Okay? So what does this have to do with parenting? There's 3 primary things. Okay? One of the primary questions that parents always have is, what is causing my child's behavior? Right? This is an empirical question. 2, what are the right accommodations for my child? This is an empirical question. 3, how can we get away from the dogma and conditioning that makes us all feel like crap around there only being one right way, whether it's in the behavioral paradigm and the medical paradigm, or even within the neurodiversity space. Okay? Because this type of like, this is the one way or this is the one logic appears in all spaces. Okay? But what we really care about is defining your unique approach to your unique child in a way that really moves the needle for your family's peace and your child's well-being. That's what we care about. So let's take the first question. What is causing our child's behavior? Okay, so often we have a hypothesis. Maybe we've done a lot of research, or we have a therapist or a pediatrician. Maybe we've received a diagnosis, and then we're operating from that hypothesis. So let's take sensory processing disorder, for example, which is where I started with my son. when I started my journey with neurodiversity, etc., it was sensory processing disorder. So that was the root cause logic of like, my son is screaming because he is perceiving pain around how bright the lights are and how scratchy his clothes are, and he needs a compression shirt and a weighted blanket and fidgets. Okay. And that's not a wrong assumption. He does have sensory issues, but that wasn't the primary root cause of some of the most paradoxical and distressing behaviors. Okay. So it became an empirical question. And I wrote an entire blog about sensory processing disorder that I didn't share that publicly because every time I wrote a post, I was like, this doesn't make logical sense. The root cause of sensory is not explaining some of these, like, why sometimes when he has no tags on his shirt, he's completely fine getting dressed, and other times he's physically fighting me with the same shirt, right? So that's data. That's empirical data. That's like, this might not be the main reason that he's having this response. So once we start to trust ourselves of like, oh, I'm observing, this might not be the root cause, then we can start opening ourselves up with curiosity and experimenting with other root causes. For example, maybe the reason he's not getting his shirt on is not because of how it feels, it's because of his perception of autonomy around whether or not he wears the shirt and how my interaction around the shirt is either putting me in a mentorship and equality energy where he's perceiving felt safety on a subconscious level, or I'm rushed and frustrated and I'm like, put on the tagless shirt, it's time to go. He perceives me above him. His survival brain is like, I'm going to die. And he starts screaming, right? So that's just one example of like the root causes and the empirical data being important to pay attention to and trusting yourself, right? Because what we always go to is, I'm doing this wrong. There must be something wrong with me as a parent. I'm not consistent enough, or there's something wrong with my kid and I'm just not good at the sensory approach. And that is where we all fall as parents, instead of just taking a step back and being like, oh, the data is telling me something else is going on, right? And this is why we want to get into that scientist mindset. The next question. I had a recent question today in the moderated community. Is my child's constant movement, lack of focus, and hyperactivity related to ADHD, or is it PDA, right? And as one of the coaches running the program, I have to be honest, I don't know, right? Like, I'm not a clinician, but also this is an empirical question, meaning we need to experiment with a new approach that's not behaviorally based, and that's why you're here, consistently for 3 months, and then see, what does the data tell us about the movement, hyperactivity, and lack of focus? As we start to implement accommodations like lowering demands, declarative language, signaling safety with our tone and voice and facial expressions, getting physically lower than the child to preempt that perception of threat. After 3 months, if we do that consistently, we're going to see, oh, are they still as hyperactive? And is there still as much movement, like constant movement? And is there still a lack of focus? That's the empirical question. But if we don't experiment with a different way, we can't get that data on our specific child, right? And so, for example, let's say you're never going to take the paradigm shift program, and that's absolutely fine. You're here using the resources and DIYing it. That's awesome. I'm so glad you're here. But what I want to encourage you to do is be disciplined and take what you're learning and experiment. Be like, okay, for the next month, I am going to go all in on this PDA lens and see what changes, because that's going to tell you much more about the root cause, whether it's related to executive functioning and ADHD or PDA, than any clinician. I'm just saying it, than any clinician, because it's your child. And really, these diagnostic categories are just categories, and it's our best guess with snapshots. But what really tells us about the root cause is what shifts in your home. So I'll give you this same example with ADHD with my son. And I do believe he is also ADHD, but when 4 years ago, he was in such constant motion, like it was like he could not not be in motion. And it was like ultimate hyperactivity, could not focus on anything or engage in anything, lots of destruction, impulsivity, etc. So it would have made sense that that would have been his first diagnosis, but he got an autism diagnosis. However, after a year of consistently working through the logic and root cause of lowering the overall nervous system activation, what shifted? He was not as in constant motion or hyperactive. And that I could discern, oh, that was fight or flight. That was fight or flight related. That was related to his amygdala and his survival brain, and bringing down that through the PDA lens is what worked for my son. Does that mean it's going to work for every single person who ever listens to this podcast or live or stumbles upon this page? No. Sometimes it's going to be, actually, it wasn't related to autonomy, and really we need to explore these strategies with ADHD. Maybe they're a little bit more behavioral. Maybe you're exploring medication. But the point is, you are in charge of figuring this out, right? Especially if your child has a complex neurodivergent brain, which most of these kids do. It's never just one thing, in my opinion, right? Like, for example, after a year of working through the PDA lens with my son, he still was having trouble leaving the house. But what I noticed, the data showed me that although all these other things had improved, like access to basic needs, his nervous system activation, and his connection with me, which are the three things we measure related to PDA as data, he was having trouble leaving the house, and he was ruminating, and there was fear there. And I realized, like, okay, he might have something else going on, like generalized anxiety, right? But with that foundation of trust and the clarity that I had around what was related to what, then we could explore generalized anxiety and medication for that, right? So it's about getting you clarity. It's not about like, it's either PDA or it's nothing. It's either accommodations or it's nothing, right? Like, this is not a philosophical approach. I'm really passionate about taking a scientific approach, because beneath my work in PDA, what drives me is wanting your family to be at peace and your child to be well, and to reduce violence in society. Violence towards self, violence towards others, okay? So the second place the empirical question comes up that we need to be cognizant of and explore, and we can, is the question of, is this accommodation or approach, specific aspect of it, right for my child, right? So let me give you an example. I'm going to tell you a funny story. Maybe you'll think it's funny, maybe you won't. But before we had any awareness of PDA, my husband and I, when we were living in Washington, D.C., and this is before we had our second child, we would often have my son Cooper spend the night at my mother-in-law's house in downtown D.C. to give us a break, because we were in that constant undivided attention and like not understanding why we needed to be constantly vigilant with Cooper. So he always had a really difficult time with the transition, but we had observed that the goofier we were, the more it would make the transition easier. What I did not understand at the time was that, like, we were using play and humor as a way of bringing down his nervous system activation. So that's one of 12 accommodations that I teach. What would my husband do? He would pretend like he didn't notice that the back of his shorts came down, and he would moon my son as they were driving off or like getting into the car. And my son loved it. Like, he would be laughing and he would just be getting out of his survival brain because of that accommodation that we were intuiting. Okay. So, you know, if you're listening to this, you might be like, Casey, that's weird. But humor has been a very important accommodation, not just for my family, but also for many of the families I've worked with. And many of them have intuited this type of goofy bathroom humor, maybe even a little bit of swearing, to bring down the activation, okay? However, when I've posted something about this humor accommodation, or even when we're working through the accommodations in the program I run, sometimes parents are like, that wouldn't work for my kid, or, you know, that's just going to activate them more, etc. Okay, so that is to me like, yeah, of course, like that's the data, right? But sometimes I encourage people to experiment. Like, for example, if the resistance is, I feel weird about doing that, that's not really my personality, I might encourage the person to be like, why don't we just try and be a little goofy in X moment and see, does it de-escalate or does it escalate? Because that's the empirical question, right? However, if I have a parent who's like, I've tried this and I've observed, like, if I try and be goofy in X moment, it activates or my child gets mad at me, then I'm never going to say, you're doing it wrong. You're not doing this accommodation consistently enough. You actually need to do it 10 times before we know, right? I'm going to trust the parent, but that also means I expect on the other side of things, on the other side of this screen, parents to take responsibility for like, I'm just strewing options that we can experiment and not being like, that doesn't work, because for some people it does, right? And so what we want to do is we want to approach it with curiosity, look at the suggestion and decide, is this something I could experiment with and collect data on? Or do I have a strong enough understanding of either my nervous system or my kids where like, this isn't something I'm ready to experiment with, right? And that's okay. It doesn't mean, and I feel very passionately about this because so much of my experience as a mother who is a trained social scientist was, this is the way to do it. There's only one way. This is evidence-based and gold standard. Now go implement. And if it doesn't work, it's because you're doing it wrong. Instead of, maybe we had the wrong logic about how your kid's brain worked, and maybe we need to pan out and look through a different lens and not push the kid through it and not put them in timeout and not punish them or use sticker charts, right? To me, this logic of like, there is only one way does not make sense to me, because it's like, there are lots of different ways and lots of different root causes and lots of different approaches, right? But because of our conditioning and the society that exists around education, parenting, and autism, it's only one way. And if it's not working, you're doing it wrong. Okay. So again, like the question of Casey, how much screen time should I give my kid? This is an empirical question. What tools and skills can I give you to explore that? That's what I can provide, but I don't have the answer to that because it's your child. Okay, so what we might do if we were corresponding in the moderated community, or if I was spot coaching you, or if we were in a container, I might say, okay, let's look at the data that you have now, right? Let's look at the logic, right? What do you observe? Do they, what are they gravitating towards? How are they using the screen time? When they get off, how activated are they? How is it impacting their basic needs? And then I'm going to encourage the parent to make a decision based on that information, develop a hypothesis and make a decision. I think if we reduce screen time by X amount for 2 weeks, it would reduce the trouble with sleeping. Okay, so that's a hypothesis. I don't know if that's true because we have to try it and then observe. Again, we collect the data, right? So this is why I don't give like blanket advice, but rather feel very passionate about giving you the tools and skills that you need so that you can find your unique path, because it is not a one size fits all, right? So finally, I already touched upon this, but like, why is a curiosity mindset so important? And why do we need this, right? In this day and age, even outside of the neurodiversity space, but empirical questions and understanding what that means and how to use it, it allows you to get into a curiosity mindset, pan out, and get a little bit creative. Okay. So often we're viewing things as like, this is the gold standard. This is the only way. Whereas the best way might be something we need to experiment with and try differently and consistently. Okay. So it just drives me nuts when we have so many of these children, and I have them in my programs. I see your comments, I get the emails, and it's like the vast majority have been only working through one logic and one paradigm, which is the behavioral paradigm, the exposure paradigm, right? And I want to state, there are elements of those paradigms that work. I am an anxious person. Exposure and some behavioral approaches have supported my anxiety, right? I see that with my son too. However, what the trend or pattern is that when these approaches clearly don't work for families, instead of our clinicians, our pediatricians, our teachers, and I'm not saying all, but so often our therapists are saying, well, if it's not working, it's something that you're doing. Instead of just saying, this is the wrong logic, let's take another approach. Okay, so I just want to end with the primary point, which is like, you have to be the scientist of your child. You have to take the reins. You have to decide, right? Because nobody is going to know more than you do. Truly. Even though, I've worked with hundreds, I've worked with over 1,000 families now through the program and through my coaching. And if you stepped into a call with me, I wouldn't know the answers. I would be guiding you to find your answers, right? And the same is true for even the most renowned clinicians, right? Like, they're going to have good ideas. They're going to have snapshots. They're going to be using the canon of their discipline to understand their best guess or hypothesis or even diagnosis. But ultimately, it is an empirical question, what works for your family to find peace and to support your specific child. All right, I'm going to sign off, my friends. It was so good to be here with you, and I appreciate all your perspectives, and we will see you again soon. Okay, bye. Thanks, everyone, for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.